In this week's episode, we'll be building a bent laminated coat rack with sliding hooks. This is also my second entry for the Bentwood challenge, which is an online challenge run by Rockler and the guys behind the Modern Maker podcast. The form that I'm using is the same that I used in my previous episode, episode 5, to make a bookshelf. It is made from 3 layers of MDF, and the wood that you can see me cutting here is ash, the white one, and the darker one is a fumed oak. Now I chose this because of both their contrast in color, but also because both ash and oak are known for their bending ability. Now I'll be skipping through the first steps of this quite fast because I've covered that in a lot of detail in the previous episode, so please be sure to check that out. There are, however, 2 points that I learned in the second project that I thought is worth mentioning though. The first one is to, as you can see me doing here, check which way your veneers bend more naturally. It always bends easier in one direction than the other, and then making sure you're bending it in that same direction when you're assembling it around the form. And then the second one is to sand all your veneers whilst they are still flat before you start bending it, because once you've bent it and it has round corners, it becomes a pain in the ass to sand, and it is much easier doing it, as you can see here, whilst it is flat. For this, I started with 120 grit and worked my way up to 240 grit. To bend it, I wrapped the veneer in a plastic sleeve made from just a little bit of a thicker gauge dust sheet that you can buy from a hardware store, and attached a wallpaper steamer to it. Then I steamed it for about, I'd say, 25 minutes, then folded it around the form and made sure to clamp it tightly before leaving it overnight to dry. The next morning, after removing the clamps, I just glued 3 of the 4 layers because I still had some work to do on the metal rods before I wanted to glue the final layer on. Now these 2 metal rods will form the horizontal rails on which the hooks will be running. And here I'm just making sure that they are completely clean using a little bit of white spirits and some steel wool, because new metal comes with a little bit of oiliness and you will struggle to get the paint to adhere to that if you spray it straight onto it. Now the next step, I'm not even sure if that's necessary after you clean it properly, but I just run a 240 grit sandpaper over it just to give it a little bit of extra key so that the spray will stick to it properly. Then I drilled these small holes in the ends of each so that I could secure a screw into it and tie a little bit of rope on. And the reason for this is just so that I could suspend the metal bars from a high point in the garden to make the spray painting easier. For the spray, I just used a little bit of leftover spray that I had in cans. The first one I used was Rust-Oleum's Universal Matte Black, but I ran out kind of after the first layer and then finished it with Hammerite's Direct to Rust Smooth Black. Now, both of these can go straight onto unprimed metal, which again just felt like it saves a little bit of time just because I didn't need to prime it first. For these rods, I just used 2 coats and the coverage was absolutely fine. But just remember as a general rule to take your time and, if necessary, apply a couple more thin coats rather than try to rush and do it with thick coats, because you don't want it to become thick and sticky. And also, just, it sounds obvious, but read the manufacturer's instructions on curing times and make sure to follow that. Well, so whilst the paint was drying, I did some more work on my frame just by cutting the excess veneer off with a jigsaw and routering it down to its final width using a palm router. Now that my frame was structurally built, I could start mounting the metal rods into it. To do this, I marked out the holes, taking care to measure accurately, as you'd be able to see any variance very easily if the rails were not perfectly parallel. Now, one way to make sure your drill finds its mark as accurately as possible is to use a center punch to mark it, and then pre-drilling it with a thinner bit before drilling the final diameter holes. Now, with most projects you have to do a little bit of fixing here and there, and this one was no exception, because when I removed the veneer I was left with just that little bit of overlap where the pressure from the clamps forced the veneer to stretch a little bit more and climb over each other. To fix this, I just cut the overlapping layer with a sharp blade, so I then could lay it flat and glue it back in place. Now that we have the frame and the metal rails mounted, all that are left to do are the hooks. And for this I used 2 meters of 30mm walnut dowels that I bought online. As I didn't want to waste any of my actual dowels, I cut an off-cut piece of MDF to the same dimensions and shape as the final hooks were going to be. I then drilled the holes as per my design drawing, and using this test piece and 2 longish drill bits, I set up a quick test jig. And this is because there were 2 things that I was concerned about during the design. The one was I wanted to make sure that the hooks stayed up when I flipped them up, and the other one was that the bottom hooks didn't catch on the top rail. So far, so good. Now that I knew my design sizes are correct, I built a quick cutting jig straight onto my miter block. To do this, I cut a 45-degree angle out of a piece of offcut and then simply mounted it to the exact position using my test piece as a reference. To get the first 45-degree cut, I simply used the vertical 45-degree slot in the miter. Then I used the jig to cut the angles of the hook and a little mark I made on the miter to cut them to length. You are of course cutting 2 hook angles with each 45-degree cut, so it goes much faster than one thinks. One tool I definitely did miss in this project was a drill press, or at least a drill guide. It would have made it so much easier and quicker to drill accurate and repeatable holes for each of the hooks, but I had to make do. And for this I just built a little drilling jig using 2 layers of 15mm pine, which when stacked up equals the 30mm of the dowels. Now I used a little bit of super glue to get it all into position before then securing it with a couple of screws. To get the exact position of the holes, I marked the center with a center punch and then used this as a reference point for a thin drill bit before fixing the cross piece with 2 screws into position. With the jig made, it was quick to drill all the holes, and I found to prevent breakout on the other side of the dowel, drilling with very light pressure gave me quite good results. To give each of the holes just a little bit more of a rounded look, I touched each end with a reamer bit, which is designed for doing exactly that. To finish the end of the hooks, I used a 45-degree router bit with a guide bearing and set this so it just took the edge of the ends. Now, to give my hand a bit more clearance from the bit, I cut a makeshift pushing block from a piece of scrap MDF, which I used to apply the side pressure onto the blade. Routers are great tools, but you have to be careful around them, so anything you can do to get your hands further away from the spinny bit at the front is a good thing. As with the frame, I sanded each of the hooks down to a 240 grit, and by wrapping a small piece around the tip of a screwdriver, I even managed to get a nice sanding on the side of the holes. Personally, I buy sandpaper both in sheets and rolls, but this is where the rolls come in nicely, because you can clamp a longer piece onto the workbench and then it is quick to sand small pieces of wood on it rather than trying to faff about with holding small pieces of sandpaper in your hand. For a finish, I use a matte oil by Osmo, which just gives it such a lovely natural feel. 2 or 3 layers of this just transforms any piece of wood you apply it to, and I use it on almost everything that I make. To apply it, I use non-abrasive pads, which you can easily find online, and I started using it myself after seeing Matt Eslier explaining his method in quite a lot of detail on his channel, and so be sure to check that out. Here I am applying the first coat with a small piece of the pad and then rubbing it down with a dry piece afterwards. The trick to applying Osmo, I find, is applying thin layers and not letting any thick areas dry without having a chance to rub it down. You are effectively adding a layer, then rubbing it down 5 or 10 minutes later, so it only leaves the oil that was absorbed by the wood, rather than trying to add a layer over the surface of the wood as you would when painting it. I hope that makes sense. Whilst drying these in the next room to save them from picking up dust, I could turn my attention back to the frame. Although I sanded the bulk of these when they were still flat pieces of veneer at the beginning of the video, once you expose wood to steam or water, the moisture will raise the grain a bit as the fibers swell and expand. It is this raised grain that I'm sanding back here, but because I've done most of the sanding before, it doesn't take very long to do. To fit the rails into the frame, I had to persuade it a little bit with a hammer, which is really what I want because it guarantees a nice tight fit. At this point I was quite looking forward to this. I fitted the hooks one by one onto each of the rows, taking care that they are all the right way around so that when they are mounted they face the right way up. I left the rails slightly long on purpose, and now that I have the exact length of the frame I can cut the excess down using my angle grinder. These vertical slits I'm cutting here into the ends are simply to give the glue more area to hold on. You'll see what I mean shortly. Before I could glue the rails in, I had to set my frame to its correct width. For this, I cut 2 pieces of wood to the exact width of the mold and clamped it all up before gluing the ends of the rods into the holes using Gorilla Glue. After the glue dried, I cut off the excess and sanded it flat before laminating the 4th and final layer of veneer onto the frame. Now, the reason I had to wait was that I didn't want the ends of the metal rods to be visible from the sides. As you can see here, it's covered. Once dried, I then followed the same steps as before to cut, router, plane, and sand the last layer to its final width. Now that the piece was effectively finished, I moved on to mounting it. And to be honest, I didn't have this completely figured out until this point. One thing I was completely sure about was that I didn't want to use mirror plates, because if they are visible, it just always looks like a little bit of shoddy work, so I wanted to avoid that. So what I ended up doing was to cut 3 pieces of leftover dowels just shorter than the depth of the frame, drilled holes into the centers, and then finished them off in the same way that I did the hooks. I then screwed 6mm threaded rods into the centers of each of these and made sure they were all the same length. After some very careful measuring, I then drilled 3 10mm holes into the wall to receive the expanding bolts, and the only ones that I had were these ones that are really designed for drywalls, but I simply added a generous amount of Gorilla Glue and shoved the whole assembly into the holes. I made sure to do all the fine tuning to get it all level whilst the glue was wet, and then I let it dry for about 2 hours. Whilst I was waiting for the glue to cure, I applied a final coat of Osmo oil to the whole frame and the hooks again, which is always, without fail, such an exciting step in any project. Back in the hallway, the Gorilla Glue worked perfectly, and after cleaning out the excess that expanded out of the hole, I also applied some Osmo oil to the mounting dowels. Here I'm marking the final mounting position of the frame before drilling 3 small holes through the frame into each of the dowels, which are going to hold the frame in its final position. Now the hooks were designed to slide and spin around, so to keep them the right way up whilst I mounted it in place, I just cable tied a piece of wood across the whole lot and then screwed it into place. Mounting the piece using this method worked so well. The fact that the mounts are the same material as the hooks means that it doesn't visually distract from the piece, and also the fact that it's screwed into 3 different points makes for a very, very sturdy mount, which is exactly what I wanted. I also need to mention that although the finished piece I made in this video looks completely different to his, the way the hooks are mounted on a sliding rail has been inspired by Sebastian Jorgensen, a Danish designer that co-owns a company called We Do Wood. So do check them out, as they've got really nice stuff. And lastly, if you have not already done so, do remember to subscribe and hit that bell button below so you are notified of any future episodes. Until next time, thanks for watching. Goodbye.